Unaware she owned the company they worked for, Jessica Monroe stood in the doorway of what used to be her home, clutching her 3 newborn triplets against her chest as her husband and his mistress kicked her and her babies out at midnight. But what she did when his mother laughed would shock them all in ways they never saw coming. The rain hammered down on the cracked pavement outside the luxury townhouse, but Jessica's hands remained steady, even as her husband Daniel blocked the entrance with his body while his mistress Claire stood behind him with a smirk that could cut glass, neither of them knowing that the woman they were casting into the street with 3 helpless infants actually owned Monroe Industries, the very corporation that signed both their paychecks. Daniel's mother, Margaret, stood in the foyer cackling like this was the finest entertainment she'd witnessed in years. But her laughter would soon turn to horror when the truth emerged from the shadows Jessica had carefully cultivated. How could a husband betray the mother of his children so completely without knowing her true identity? What kind of mistress celebrates throwing newborn triplets into a storm at midnight? Why would a mother-in-law find such cruelty amusing rather than appalling? What happened during the following hours that transformed Jessica from a desperate mother on the street into the architect of their absolute destruction? The answers would unravel everything they thought they knew about power, loyalty, and the catastrophic price of underestimating the woman who gave you everything. If this is your first time on this channel, kindly subscribe and hit the notification for more interesting stories. Now, sit back and let's dive into the story. Jessica Monroe had built her empire on secrets, but the greatest secret of all was the one she kept from her own husband. 6 years before that midnight confrontation, she'd inherited Monroe Industries from her grandfather, William Monroe. But the inheritance came with a peculiar stipulation that would shape everything that followed. William had been a self-made billionaire who watched his own children tear apart smaller fortunes through entitlement and greed. So when he drafted his will, he included a clause that seemed eccentric but proved prophetic. His granddaughter would receive everything on the condition that she never reveal her ownership to any romantic partner until their 5th wedding anniversary. People show you who they really are when they think you have nothing. William had told her 3 days before his death, his weathered hands gripping hers in his hospital room. Power reveals character, but perceived powerlessness reveals truth. Jessica had been 23 then, fresh out of business school, idealistic but not naive. She'd watched her grandfather build Monroe Industries from a single manufacturing plant into a conglomerate with 17 divisions spanning tech, real estate, pharmaceuticals, and media. But she'd also watched him bury 2 of his 3 children after their reckless lifestyles caught up with them. Her own father had died in a racing accident at 34, chasing thrills purchased with money he'd never earned. The stipulation made sense even if it complicated her life in ways she couldn't fully anticipate. Monroe Industries operated under a corporate structure so complex that only the executive board and the company attorneys knew the true ownership. But the public face of the company was CEO Richard Hammond, a brilliant strategist Jessica had personally selected to run operations while she remained in the shadows. To the world, to her future husband, to everyone except a handful of trusted advisors, Jessica Monroe was simply a mid-level marketing consultant who happened to have a comfortable trust fund from her deceased grandfather. She met Daniel Crawford 2 years after assuming secret ownership of Monroe Industries, but their meeting was no accident, even if he never suspected the truth. Daniel worked in the sales division of Monroe Industries' pharmaceutical subsidiary, a charismatic account executive with an impressive closing record and ambitions that exceeded his current position. Jessica had actually been reviewing quarterly reports when his name appeared in connection with a particularly lucrative contract, but she'd decided to attend a company mixer where she knew he'd be present, disguised as just another employee attending a networking event. "You look lost," Daniel had said, approaching her with a confidence that bordered on arrogance but didn't quite cross the line. Jessica had smiled, playing the part perfectly. First time at one of these corporate things. I usually work remotely. That first conversation stretched into hours, but Jessica was conducting an interview even as Daniel thought he was simply charming and attractive woman. She asked questions that seemed casual but revealed his values, his integrity, his dreams, and for those first few months, the answers satisfied her. Daniel spoke about wanting to build something meaningful, about integrity in business, about the importance of family, all the things that made Jessica believe she'd found someone who could love her for herself rather than her fortune. They married 14 months later, in a ceremony that Daniel's mother, Margaret, attended with barely concealed disappointment that her son hadn't married someone from a more prestigious family. A marketing consultant with a small trust fund, Margaret had whispered to her sister during the reception, unaware that Jessica stood close enough to hear. Daniel could have done so much better. Jessica had smiled through the subtle digs and the passive-aggressive comments because she'd made a commitment to see this through, but seeds of doubt were already taking root in soil that would eventually yield a bitter harvest. Still, the first 3 years of marriage seemed to validate her choice, as Daniel appeared devoted and Margaret's coldness seemed like nothing more than typical mother-in-law territorialism rather than genuine malice. The cracks began showing during year 4 when Jessica discovered she was pregnant with triplets. 3 babies. Daniel's face had drained of color when the ultrasound technician delivered the news. How are we supposed to afford 3 babies on our salaries? Jessica had reached for his hand, but he'd pulled away, his mind already calculating costs and limitations based on the financial reality he believed they faced. We'll figure it out. My trust fund. Your trust fund barely covers your student loans and your car payment, Daniel interrupted, his voice tight with stress that seemed disproportionate to someone who should have been celebrating impending fatherhood. I was hoping to make division manager next year, but even with that raise, 3 kids? Jessica, this is going to completely derail our plans. The conversation had continued for hours, but Jessica noticed something troubling in Daniel's response. He framed everything in terms of his career, his plans, his trajectory, with the babies positioned as obstacles rather than blessings. She'd dismissed it as shock, as understandable anxiety about becoming a father of multiples, but the pattern persisted throughout her pregnancy. Daniel began working longer hours, but the extra time at the office didn't correlate with improved performance or the promotion he claimed to be pursuing. Monroe Industries had strict policies about workplace relationships, and the company employed sophisticated monitoring systems to ensure compliance. So when the security report landed on Jessica's private desk 5 months into her pregnancy, she'd felt the foundation of her marriage crack beneath her feet. The report detailed a relationship between Daniel Crawford and Claire Morrison, a junior analyst in the same division, including time-stamped security footage of them entering and leaving hotels during lunch hours and after-hours meetings that had nothing to do with business. Jessica's head of security had delivered the report with professional detachment, but his eyes held sympathy. I'm sorry, Ms. Monroe, do you want me to initiate termination procedures? She'd stared at the photographs for 17 minutes before responding, her hands unconsciously moving to her swelling belly, where 3 lives grew unaware of the betrayal unfolding around them. No, not yet. I need to see how this plays out. Ma'am, company policy. I own the company, James, Jessica had said quietly, her voice steady despite the earthquake inside her chest. The policy serves me, not the other way around. Continue monitoring, but take no action. I need to understand the full scope before I make any decisions. The monitoring continued throughout her pregnancy, but the truth expanded beyond simple infidelity into something far more calculated and cruel. Daniel wasn't just having an affair, he was planning an exit strategy. The additional reports revealed conversations between Daniel and Claire about Jessica's supposed inadequacy, her boring personality, her lack of sophistication, but the most damning evidence came from recordings of Daniel discussing his marriage with Claire in explicit detail. He'd married Jessica believing her trust fund was substantial, but disappointment had set in when he realized the money wasn't the fortune he'd expected, and now he was trapped with a pregnant wife and financial obligations that would anchor him to mediocrity. "Once the babies are born, I'll give it 6 months," Daniel had told Claire during a conversation recorded in his company car. "Long enough that I don't look like a complete monster, but then I'm done. My lawyer says that with 3 kids, child support will be brutal, but at least I'll be free." Claire's response had been equally callous. "We could be so good together if you weren't tied down. I'm never having kids. That's not the life I want." Jessica had listened to that recording 4 times, her hands pressed against her belly, feeling her daughters move inside her, unaware that their father viewed them as anchors rather than blessings. The pain was immense, but beneath the pain something colder and harder began to form, a plan that would require patience, precision, and perfect timing. She would give Daniel exactly what he wanted, but on terms he couldn't possibly anticipate. The triplets arrived 6 weeks early, but all 3 girls, Emma, Sophie, and Grace, were healthy despite their premature entrance into a world that held more complexity than their tiny hearts could comprehend. Daniel had been present for the birth, but his performance of devoted father rang hollow to Jessica, even as the nurses cooed over his apparent dedication. He held each baby for exactly the right amount of time for the photographs, made the appropriate social media posts about being blessed with 3 beautiful daughters, but Jessica noticed how quickly he handed them back, how his eyes drifted to his phone even during those first precious hours. Margaret had arrived at the hospital with criticism disguised as concern, commenting on the baby's size, their slightly jaundiced skin, the overwhelming responsibility Jessica had taken on by having 3 at once. "I hope you've thought about how you'll manage," Margaret had said, her voice dripping with doubt. "Daniel works such long hours and you don't have family to help. Perhaps you should consider hiring help, though I don't know how you'd afford it." Jessica had smiled through the veiled insults because she was playing a longer game, but she'd also instructed her attorney to begin preparing documents that would be needed in exactly 6 months and 4 days. The first few weeks home with the triplets revealed Daniel's true character in ways that surveillance footage never could. He complained about the crying, about the constant feedings, about how Jessica had let herself go despite having given birth to 3 humans mere weeks earlier. He worked even longer hours, claiming his upcoming performance review required extra dedication, but Jessica's security team confirmed he was spending those extra hours with Claire in an apartment Monroe Industries technically owned through one of its real estate subsidiaries. Margaret visited frequently, but her visits brought criticism rather than support. Jessica was feeding the babies wrong, holding them wrong, responding too quickly to their cries, creating dependent children who would never learn self-soothing. The litany of judgment was endless, but Jessica endured it while documenting every comment, every criticism, every moment of hostility that would later prove invaluable. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night when the triplets were exactly 7 weeks old. Jessica had been awake for 37 hours straight because all 3 babies had developed colds simultaneously, their tiny systems struggling with congestion and fevers that required constant monitoring. Daniel had been at the office for the previous 2 nights, but security footage showed him at Claire's apartment enjoying uninterrupted sleep while his wife battled exhaustion and fear that one of their daughters might stop breathing. He'd returned home at 11:47 p.m., but he hadn't come alone. Claire had been with him, giggling about something as they approached the door, both of them clearly having enjoyed drinks at a bar that security identified as being 12 blocks from the office Daniel claimed to have been working in. Margaret had also been present, having let herself in with the key Daniel had given her despite Jessica's explicit request that his mother not have unsupervised access to their home. Jessica had been in the nursery with Sophie, who was running a 101.3-degree fever, when she heard voices in the living room. 3 voices engaged in conversation that grew louder as she listened. "It's not sustainable," Margaret was saying, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having her opinions accepted as fact. 3 babies, medical bills, and a wife who can't even keep herself presentable. Daniel, you deserve better than this. "I know, Mom." Daniel's response was tired, but not with the exhaustion of a father caring for sick children, with the weariness of someone going through motions he resented. "I'm handling it." "You're not handling it, you're suffering through it." Claire's voice joined the conversation, and Jessica felt ice form in her veins. "We could be so happy together. You don't owe her anything just because she got pregnant. People get divorced all the time." Jessica had stood frozen, holding her feverish daughter, listening to her husband and his mistress discuss her marriage in her own living room, while his mother encouraged the betrayal. The scene was so outrageous it would have been comical if it hadn't been devastating, but Jessica's legal training kicked in, and she'd quietly activated the recording function on her phone before stepping into the hallway. "You brought her here?" Jessica's voice had been quiet, but it cut through their conversation like a blade. "You brought your mistress into our home while our daughters are sick upstairs?" Daniel had the decency to look startled, but Claire's expression showed no shame, only irritation at being interrupted. Margaret actually smiled, a thin, cruel expression that revealed exactly who she'd always been beneath the veneer of respectability. "Jessica, we need to talk," Daniel said, but his tone carried no apology, only resignation. "This isn't working. You know it's not working." "Our daughters are 7 weeks old and sick with colds," Jessica had responded, still holding Sophie against her chest. "What exactly isn't working?" "All of it," Claire had interjected, stepping forward with confidence that suggested she'd been invited to participate in this conversation. "Daniel's been unhappy for months. He deserves a life that doesn't revolve around diapers and midnight feedings. He deserves a partner, not a burden." The words had hung in the air, cruel and precise, but Jessica had remained calm even as her heart shattered because she'd known this moment was coming. She'd been preparing for it even if the specific details exceeded her worst expectations. "So what are you suggesting?" Jessica asked, looking directly at Daniel rather than acknowledging Claire's presence. Daniel had glanced at his mother, who'd nodded encouragement before speaking. "I think you should leave. Tonight, take the babies and go stay with a friend or get a hotel or something. I need space to think, and I can't do that with constant crying and chaos." "You want me to take 3 sick newborns out of their home at midnight?" Jessica's voice remained steady, but she was recording every word, every gesture, every moment of this absolute moral collapse. "It's not really your home, though, is it?" Margaret had spoken up, her voice laced with satisfaction. "The house is in Daniel's name. You're essentially a guest who's overstayed her welcome." That was technically true. The house was in Daniel's name, purchased with what he believed was a generous loan from Jessica's trust fund, but was actually money from one of Monroe Industries' subsidiary accounts, structured to be legally recoverable under specific circumstances that Daniel's attorneys had failed to identify in their cursory review of the paperwork. "I have 3 newborns upstairs," Jessica repeated. "One with a fever. You're asking me to take them out into a storm." She gestured toward the windows where rain was indeed pelting down. "At midnight." "We're not asking," Claire said, and the cruelty in her voice was so pure it was almost impressive. "Daniel owns this house. You're here because he allows it, but he doesn't allow it anymore." Jessica had looked at Daniel, giving him one final opportunity to remember who he'd promised to be. But he couldn't meet her eyes. Instead, he'd simply said, "I think it's best if you go. We can discuss logistics tomorrow." Margaret had actually laughed then, a sound that would haunt the next several hours and ultimately seal her fate alongside her son and his mistress. The laugh was triumphant, gleeful, the sound of someone who believed they'd won a war they didn't even understand they were fighting. Jessica had gone upstairs in silence, but her mind was calculating with the precision of the business executive she actually was. She'd gathered the babies with methodical care, wrapping each daughter in the hand-knit blankets her grandfather's housekeeper had made, checking temperatures and ensuring medications were properly dosed for the hours ahead. Emma, Sophie, and Grace were blissfully unaware of the chaos surrounding them, but Jessica made a silent promise to each daughter as she secured them in their car seats. They would never again be subject to such cruelty, and they would grow up knowing their worth. The rain was indeed severe when Jessica carried the first car seat to her vehicle, but Daniel didn't offer to help with the remaining two. He stood in the doorway with Claire beside him and Margaret watching from the foyer, three people who believed they were witnessing the exit of an inconvenient woman rather than the departure of the person who controlled their professional destinies. "This is pathetic," Claire had commented as Jessica made her second trip, rain soaking through her clothes. "You should have more dignity than this." Jessica had paused, looking at the younger woman with something approaching pity. "Dignity isn't determined by circumstances, it's determined by character. You'll understand that eventually." The cryptic comment had clearly confused Claire, but Jessica hadn't elaborated. She'd simply completed her task, securing all three babies in the back seat of her car, but before getting in the driver's seat, she'd turned to face the house one final time. "6 months, Jessica said, her voice carrying across the rain-soaked lawn. "You asked for 6 months, Daniel, but you couldn't even give me that." The reference meant nothing to him because he'd never known about the recordings, about the monitoring, about the reality behind the marriage he'd entered. But Jessica's attorneys would understand perfectly when she forwarded the documentation. Margaret's laughter followed her down the driveway, but it would be the last time that woman laughed for many months to come. Jessica drove for exactly 14 minutes before pulling into the underground garage of a building Daniel had never seen, Monroe Towers, the crown jewel of her real estate portfolio and her actual residence whenever she needed to access the executive floors of Monroe Industries. The penthouse apartment spread across the entire top floor, 15,000 square feet of luxury that represented her true life rather than the modest existence she'd performed for her husband. Her actual staff, nanny, housekeeper, personal assistant, security detail, were already assembled when she arrived, having been activated by a single text message she'd sent before leaving the house. "Ms. Monroe." Her head of security, James, greeted her, immediately taking one of the car seats while the nanny took another. "Everything's prepared as you requested." The nursery in her real home had been ready for months, a contingency plan for exactly this scenario, and within minutes, all three babies were settled in specialized cribs with medical monitoring equipment that would alert the staff to any changes in their conditions. A pediatrician arrived within 20 minutes, performing thorough examinations and prescribing medications that would have Emma, Sophie, and Grace feeling better within 48 hours. Jessica had showered, changed into clothes that reflected her actual station in life, but then she'd sat in her office overlooking the city while her attorneys assembled via secure video conference. "They actually kicked you out with the babies?" Robert Harrison, her lead attorney, looked genuinely shocked despite his decades of experience with human cruelty. "At midnight in a storm with sick newborns." "All recorded," Jessica confirmed, uploading the files to the secure server. "Video and audio perfectly clear. Daniel explicitly telling me to leave, Claire asserting ownership of a property she has no legal connection to, and Margaret laughing at the entire situation. The legal team reviewed the evidence in silence, but their expressions revealed the same conclusion Jessica had already reached. This wasn't just a divorce case anymore. It was an opportunity to demonstrate the consequences of cruelty in ways that would resonate far beyond this single family. The house is recoverable under the loan terms, Robert noted, reviewing the property documents. Daniel defaulted on the morality clause the moment he brought his mistress into the residence. We can initiate foreclosure proceedings immediately. What about his employment? Jessica asked, though she already knew the answer. Workplace relationship in violation of company policy, plus using company resources to facilitate the affair. The company car, expense account charges for dinners with Claire that were reported as client meetings. Immediate termination. With cause, no severance, and potential criminal charges for expense fraud. Jessica nodded, her mind already moving through the cascading consequences. And Claire. Same violations, same consequences. But there's more. Claire's personnel file shows she's on a performance improvement plan. She should have been focused on saving her job, not pursuing her supervisor. Termination is not just justified, it's overdue. The pieces were falling into place, but Jessica wanted to ensure the response was proportional and legal, devastating but defensible. And Margaret? Robert had smiled grimly. Margaret doesn't work for Monroe Industries, but she does serve on the board of 3 charitable organizations that receive substantial funding from the Monroe Foundation. I believe those organizations would be very interested in character references regarding board members, especially if those references included evidence of her encouraging her son to abandon his sick newborn children. The plan crystallized over the following 3 hours as attorneys, accountants, and corporate strategists mapped out a response that would address the betrayal while remaining entirely within legal and ethical boundaries. But the execution would require careful timing and absolute precision. Daniel woke up the next morning with Claire beside him in the bed that used to be marital property, but his satisfaction was short-lived when his phone began receiving notifications that would destroy the foundation of his comfortable delusions. The first message was from Monroe Industries Human Resources, requesting his immediate presence for a meeting regarding serious policy violations, but the corporate language was too vague to reveal the specifics. Daniel had dressed in his best suit, believing he was finally being called in for the division manager position he'd been angling for, completely unaware that his employment was about to end in spectacular fashion. Claire received an identical message, but she'd simply shrugged it off. Probably some harassment training nonsense. I'll deal with it later. They'd arrived at Monroe Industries separately to maintain the fiction that their relationship was secret, but security directed them to different conference rooms, a detail that should have alarmed them but didn't register until it was too late. Daniel found himself facing Richard Hammond, the CEO he'd met exactly twice in his 4 years with the company, along with the head of human resources and 2 attorneys he didn't recognize. Mr. Crawford, thank you for coming in. Richard began, his tone professionally neutral but his expression severe. We need to discuss several policy violations that have come to our attention. The meeting lasted 43 minutes, but Daniel's world collapsed in the first 5 when they presented the evidence. Security footage of him and Claire entering hotels, expense reports with charges that couldn't be reconciled with actual client meetings, email communications that violated acceptable use policies. But the devastating blow came when they revealed that the company had been monitoring his activities for the previous 5 months. This is invasion of privacy, Daniel had protested, his face flushed with humiliation and growing panic. You can't just spy on employees. Your employment contract grants the company explicit rights to monitor all company resources, including vehicles, phones, computers, and building access, one attorney explained calmly. Everything we've presented was collected through systems you agreed to when you accepted employment. But there's a more serious issue. The second attorney had opened a file that made Daniel's blood run cold. The property documents for his house, the loan agreement he'd signed but never carefully read, and the morality clauses he'd violated by bringing Claire into the residence. As of last night, you defaulted on your loan agreement, the attorney explained. The property reverts to the lending entity, a Monroe Industries subsidiary, effective immediately. You have 72 hours to remove your personal possessions. You can't do this, Daniel's voice rose in disbelief. I have rights. I'll sue for wrongful termination. Richard had leaned forward, his expression hardening. Mr. Crawford, you're being terminated for cause based on documented policy violations. You committed expense fraud, engaged in a prohibited workplace relationship, and used company resources to facilitate an affair. You have no grounds for a lawsuit, but the company does have grounds to pursue criminal charges for the expense fraud. Whether we do so depends entirely on how cooperatively you exit this building. Daniel had left Monroe Industries 20 minutes later with a box containing his personal desk items, his access cards deactivated, his company phone and laptop confiscated, and his professional reputation in ruins. But the humiliation was just beginning. Claire's meeting had followed an identical trajectory, but her shock was even more profound because she'd believed Daniel's assertions that his marriage was ending anyway, that Jessica was irrelevant, that their relationship was worth the risk. Learning that Daniel had been under surveillance for months, that every intimate moment had been documented, that her career was ending because of a man who hadn't even been honest with her about his own situation, the betrayal compounded exponentially. They'd met in the parking lot, two former employees trying to process catastrophic professional consequences, but before they could even begin to formulate a plan, Daniel received a call from his mother that added another layer to the unfolding disaster. Margaret had been unceremoniously removed from 3 non-profit boards in simultaneous phone calls, each organization citing concerns about her judgment and character after receiving detailed reports about her role in the previous night's events. The charitable circuit she'd spent decades cultivating had turned on her with remarkable speed, and her social standing was disintegrating in real time. They said I encouraged you to abandon your children. Margaret's voice was shrill with panic and disbelief. They said I laughed while a mother and 3 sick babies were forced into the street. Daniel, how do they know about last night? What did you do? Daniel couldn't answer because he didn't understand what was happening, but the realization was beginning to dawn that the woman he'd underestimated for 6 years had somehow orchestrated this entire catastrophe. Jessica, he'd whispered, the name carrying the weight of terrible understanding. This is Jessica. But even that realization underestimated the scope of what was unfolding. The media coverage began 72 hours later, but it wasn't tabloid gossip. It was business journalism covering a significant corporate story. Monroe Industries announced a major restructuring of its pharmaceutical division, terminating several employees for ethics violations, while simultaneously announcing new family leave policies and workplace protection measures. The coverage was respectful and focused on corporate responsibility, but industry insiders noticed that the timing coincided with the removal of Daniel Crawford, a rising executive whose termination raised questions. Those questions got answered when a prominent business magazine published a profile piece that had actually been in development for 18 months. The Hidden Heiress, How Jessica Monroe Built an Empire from the Shadows. The article detailed Jessica's unconventional approach to managing Monroe Industries, her decision to operate behind the scenes, but the most compelling section described her grandfather's wisdom about testing character through perceived powerlessness. The piece included interviews with Richard Hammond, with board members, with employees who'd worked with the mysterious owner, who most of them had never met, but the final section contained Jessica's first public comments about her personal life. My grandfather taught me that people reveal their true nature when they believe you're powerless, Jessica had told the reporter. I spent 6 years married to a man who never knew I owned the company he worked for, and that decision gave me perfect clarity about his character. When he kicked me and our 3 newborn daughters out of our home at midnight because I no longer served his ambitions, he confirmed everything I needed to know. The article included photographs, Jessica at board meetings, Jessica reviewing architectural plans for Monroe Industries' new headquarters, Jessica holding her 3 daughters in the penthouse apartment that represented her actual life, but the most striking image showed her standing in front of Monroe Towers with a quote that became the headline, "I gave him everything except the truth, and he threw away everything that mattered." The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media erupted with debates about Jessica's deception versus Daniel's betrayal, but the prevailing sentiment sided heavily with a woman who'd been subjected to cruelty while holding the power to destroy her abusers, but had instead followed legal and ethical channels to address the situation. The story became a case study in corporate ethics, in the consequences of workplace affairs, in the dangers of underestimating people based on gender or appearance, and the narrative captured public imagination in ways that traditional corporate stories never did. Daniel's attempts to give interviews were rejected by every reputable outlet because his story, successful executive betrayed by deceptive wife, rang hollow when the facts revealed he'd been conducting an affair while his wife dealt with high-risk pregnancy, that he'd committed expense fraud, that he'd abandoned sick children. The few platforms willing to give him airtime were fringe outlets that further damaged his credibility rather than rehabilitating his reputation. Claire disappeared from public view entirely, her LinkedIn profile deleted, her social media accounts made private, her career in pharmaceuticals effectively over because Monroe Industries' influence in the sector meant no reputable company would risk hiring someone terminated for ethics violations from the industry's most respected firm. Margaret attempted to salvage her reputation through carefully worded apologies and explanations, but the charitable organizations that had removed her from their boards released statements indicating that her behavior demonstrated fundamental character flaws incompatible with nonprofit leadership, especially organizations focused on family welfare and children's services. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The legal proceedings that followed were anticlimactic because Daniel had no grounds to contest anything. The employment termination was legally airtight, the property foreclosure was contractually sound, and the custody arrangement gave Jessica full legal and physical custody, with Daniel relegated to supervised visitation pending completion of a parental fitness evaluation that would take months to complete. But the most devastating consequence wasn't legal or financial. It was social and reputational, the complete destruction of the life Daniel had tried to build on the foundation of betrayal and cruelty. 6 months after that midnight confrontation, Jessica stood in the newly renovated family wing of her penthouse apartment, watching her daughters play in a nursery that cost more than the house Daniel had kicked them out of. Emma, Sophie, and Grace had grown into healthy, happy babies, unaware of the chaos that had surrounded their early weeks, but surrounded now by people who genuinely loved them and were invested in their well-being. The staff Jessica employed weren't just hired help. They were carefully selected professionals who understood that these 3 children represented the next generation of Monroe family leadership, and their development mattered on levels beyond the typical. Richard Hammond had stepped down as CEO 6 months ahead of his planned retirement timeline, and Jessica had taken public ownership of Monroe Industries in a shareholders meeting that made financial news around the world. Her leadership style was already transforming the company culture, But her personal story became part of the corporate narrative, a reminder that power wielded ethically was more impressive than power wielded ruthlessly. Daniel had completed his parental evaluation, but the results were damning. Psychologists concluded that his inability to bond with his daughters, his continued blame of Jessica for his circumstances, and his fundamental lack of insight into his own behavior made supervised visitation the maximum safe arrangement. He saw his daughters 4 hours per month in a facility designed for high-conflict custody situations, but the visits were mechanical and joyless, fulfilling legal obligations rather than building relationships. Claire had moved to a different state and taken a position with a generic pharmaceutical distributor at a fraction of her previous salary, her ambitions permanently downsized by the consequences of her choices. But she'd given an interview to a women's website where she positioned herself as a victim of corporate overreach and powerful women weaponizing their resources. The interview was widely mocked, with commenters noting that Claire's version of victimhood involved actively participating in the destruction of a family while celebrating the abandonment of newborns. But the article remained online as a permanent monument to her lack of self-awareness. Margaret had attempted reconciliation multiple times, sending letters and gifts for the babies, but Jessica's response was consistent and firm. "You laughed while I carried sick newborns into a storm at midnight. You encouraged your son to abandon his children. Your relationship with my daughters will be determined by them when they're old enough to understand what you did. But until then, you have no place in their lives." The legal team had ensured that Margaret's role in that night's events was documented in custody records, so even if Daniel ever achieved unsupervised visitation, his mother would remain prohibited from contact with the children without explicit court approval, a situation that would require her to demonstrate substantial character reformation, which seemed unlikely given her continued insistence that she'd done nothing wrong. The house Daniel had believed he owned became a Monroe Industries property, designated for executive housing, but Jessica had specific plans for it that carried poetic justice. It would be converted into transitional housing for single mothers escaping domestic situations, women who needed a safe place to rebuild their lives. The conversion was announced with a press release that included the property's history, and the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone following the story. But beyond the public narratives and legal consequences, Jessica's private transformation was the most profound element of the entire saga. On the first anniversary of that midnight betrayal, Jessica sat in her home office reviewing the year's events with the perspective that only time and distance could provide. The question that haunted her most wasn't whether she'd been right to test Daniel through concealment. The results had validated her grandfather's wisdom in ways she'd never wanted to experience. The question was whether the test itself was ethical, whether she'd been fair to Daniel by entering a marriage with such fundamental deception at its core. Her therapist had posed this question in their weekly sessions. Did Daniel ever have a chance to be the person you needed him to be, or did the circumstances of your deception create the very outcome you feared? Jessica had wrestled with that question for months, examining her choices with the same analytical rigor she applied to business decisions, but the conclusion she reached was complex and layered with nuance. He had every chance to be a decent human being regardless of my financial status, Jessica told her therapist during their anniversary session. I didn't force him to have an affair. I didn't force him to commit expense fraud. I didn't force him to abandon his sick children at midnight. My deception created a test, but his character created the results. The therapist had nodded thoughtfully. And what about Claire and Margaret? Do they bear equal responsibility? Claire knew he was married. She knew about the babies. She participated actively in cruelty rather than just tolerating his bad behavior. And Margaret raised the man who thought this was acceptable. Yes, they bear responsibility for their choices. But Jessica also recognized that her response, while legally justified and ethically defensible, had been devastating in its precision and scope, and she'd spent considerable time ensuring that her actions aligned with her values rather than simple revenge. The Monroe Foundation had established new grant programs focused on supporting families affected by infidelity, domestic situations, and single parenthood, programs that would help thousands of people far beyond the specific individuals involved in her personal drama. The workplace policies Monroe Industries implemented became industry standards, protecting employees from the kind of predatory behavior Claire had engaged in, while also establishing support systems for employees. Managing family crises, Jessica's public profile had expanded beyond business leadership to include advocacy for women's economic empowerment, for workplace ethics, for family policy reform, but she carefully avoided positioning herself as a victim or saint. She'd been a woman with resources who used those resources effectively, and she acknowledged the privilege inherent in that reality. "Most women in my situation don't own the company," Jessica said during a keynote speech at a business ethics conference. "Most women don't have the legal teams and financial resources to respond to betrayal and cruelty with such comprehensive consequences. I had advantages that allowed me to protect myself and my children, but that creates an obligation to use those advantages to improve systems for everyone." The speech was widely praised, but Jessica knew that public perception was fickle and incomplete. People saw the dramatic narrative but rarely understood the complex emotional landscape beneath the surface. She'd loved Daniel once, or at least loved the person she'd believed him to be, and grieving that loss while managing her anger about his betrayal required constant emotional labor that didn't make for compelling headlines. The therapy, the sleepless nights, the moments when she questioned whether her entire approach to relationships was fundamentally broken. Those struggles didn't fit the narrative of powerful woman destroys those who wronged her. But Jessica also recognized that her daughters would someday read about these events, would ask questions about their father and why their family looked different from others, and she was already preparing for those conversations with the same care she applied to corporate strategy. "Your father made choices that hurt people," Jessica practiced explaining to 3 babies who couldn't yet understand. "I made choices to protect you from those consequences. Neither of us was perfect, but I promise you'll always know the truth and you'll have the information you need to form your own relationships with everyone involved when you're ready." The concept of truth had become central to Jessica's parenting philosophy in ways that were directly informed by her experience with deception. She would never lie to her daughters about their father, about his choices, about the circumstances of their family, but she would also ensure they understood that people were complex and capable of both great harm and potential growth. Daniel had recently completed a year of therapy as part of his custody arrangement, and his therapist reported modest progress in his understanding of his behavior, but Jessica remained skeptical about whether genuine transformation was possible for someone who demonstrated such profound selfishness. Still, she didn't want her skepticism to become a barrier if Daniel genuinely committed to becoming a better person and father. 2 years after that midnight confrontation on the twins' second birthday, Emma, Sophie, and Grace were turning 2, and Jessica had organized a modest celebration at the penthouse. She received an unexpected message. Daniel had written a letter, his first communication beyond the required co-parenting app exchanges, and the tone was markedly different from his previous communications. "Jessica, I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it, but I need you to know that I finally understand what I did, and the magnitude of it goes beyond what I was able to comprehend for a very long time. My therapist helped me see that I created a narrative about our marriage where you were the supporting character in my story, and I never truly saw you as a full person with your own complexity, your own worth, your own power. When I discovered you owned Monroe Industries, my first reaction was rage at being deceived, but that rage was really about having my delusions shattered. You weren't the person I'd decided you were, and instead of examining why I'd made those assumptions, I blamed you for not correcting them. I kicked my wife and our 3 newborn daughters out at midnight because they were inconvenient to the life I wanted. I brought another woman into our home because I believed I was entitled to whatever I wanted. I listened to my mother laugh at your pain because I'd been raised to believe that cruelty was acceptable if directed at people we deemed beneath us. I destroyed our family because of who I was, not because of anything you did or didn't tell me. The girls deserve better than me, but I'm trying to become someone who at least doesn't actively harm them. I don't know if I'll ever be a real father to them, but I want to at least stop being a cautionary tale. I'm sorry, those words don't change anything, but they're true. Daniel. Jessica read the letter 3 times, analyzing the language for signs of manipulation or insincerity, but her assessment was that Daniel had finally achieved at least partial insight into his behavior, though whether that insight would translate into sustained change remained uncertain. She didn't respond to the letter directly, but she did forward it to her attorney with a note. Document this. If he maintains this level of self-awareness for another year, we can discuss expanding his visitation, but the burden of proof is entirely on him. Margaret had made no similar overtures toward accountability or growth, instead continuing to position herself as a victim of Jessica's vindictiveness, and Jessica had accepted that Margaret would likely never acknowledge her role in the family's destruction. The older woman remained prohibited from contact with the children, and Jessica felt no obligation to facilitate a relationship that would require her daughters to interact with someone who'd found their abandonment amusing. Claire had disappeared from the narrative entirely, her social media presence deleted, her professional life rebuilt in obscurity, but Jessica occasionally wondered if the younger woman had gained any understanding of her actions, or if she'd simply moved on without reflection. The answer didn't particularly matter. Claire was no longer relevant to Jessica's life, beyond being a minor character in a story that had transformed into something far more significant. Monroe Industries continued to thrive under Jessica's public leadership, but the company culture had shifted in ways that went beyond policy changes. Employees knew that the CEO had experienced betrayal and vulnerability, that she understood the challenges of balancing professional ambitions with personal crises, and that understanding created an environment where people felt safe reporting problems rather than hiding them until they became catastrophic. The story of Jessica's secret ownership and subsequent revelation had become part of the company's mythology, but it was framed as a lesson about integrity rather than a tale of revenge. William Monroe's wisdom about testing character through perceived powerlessness became a corporate value that influenced hiring decisions, promotion criteria, and leadership development programs. But perhaps the most significant outcome was entirely personal and private. Emma, Sophie, and Grace were developing distinct personalities, and Jessica saw in each daughter a reflection of different aspects of her own character: Emma's quiet determination, Sophie's analytical mind, Grace's creative spirit. Raising 3 strong girls who would someday inherit Monroe Industries and all the responsibility that entailed was the most challenging and rewarding aspect of Jessica's life, and she approached it with the same strategic thinking she applied to business. Your grandfather told me that power reveals character, Jessica would tell her daughters during bedtime stories, using language they'd grow into understanding. He was right, but he was only partially right. It's not just having power that reveals character, it's how you respond when power is used against you. I want you to remember that you have power, but you also have responsibility to use it wisely. The girls were too young to fully comprehend the lessons, but Jessica was building a foundation that would serve them throughout their lives, and she was doing so with the benefit of painful experience about what happened when character failed to match responsibility. 5 years after that midnight confrontation, Jessica Monroe stood at a podium addressing the Monroe Industries annual shareholders meeting, but the presentation focused on the company's new initiatives supporting work-life balance and family leave policies that went far beyond legal requirements. We've learned that investing in our employees' lives outside work makes them more effective during work hours, Jessica explained to the assembled shareholders. But more importantly, we've learned that companies have an obligation to support the full humanity of the people who build them, not just extract their labor during convenient hours. The policies had actually increased productivity while reducing turnover, so even the most profit-focused shareholders couldn't object to the results. But Jessica knew that the real value went beyond financial metrics. Emma, Sophie, and Grace sat in the executive viewing area with their nanny, watching their mother address a room full of powerful people, and Jessica made sure to look up and wave at her daughters periodically. The girls were 5 years old now, starting kindergarten in the fall, beginning to understand that their mother's work was important, but also that their mother's primary commitment was to them. Daniel had achieved unsupervised visitation after 3 years of consistent therapy and demonstrated improvement in his engagement with the girls, but he remained a peripheral figure in their lives, someone they saw every other weekend, someone they called Daddy, but didn't yet understand in the way they understood their mother. Jessica had facilitated the relationship because it was important for her daughters to have access to their father, but she'd also been clear with Daniel that earning their trust and love required sustained effort over years, not just showing up and going through motions. Margaret had never reconciled with the family, and the girls knew nothing about their paternal grandmother beyond the fact that she existed somewhere but wasn't part of their lives. Jessica had documented everything in therapy sessions and legal filings, preparing for the day when Emma, Sophie, and Grace would be old enough to ask why, and she would present them with facts rather than emotional manipulation. Claire had sent a letter on the 5-year anniversary of her termination, attempting some form of apology or closure, but Jessica had read the first paragraph, recognized it as another attempt at self-justification, and filed it with other irrelevant correspondence without finishing it. Some people deserved second chances, but some had demonstrated so clearly who they were that monitoring their evolution wasn't worth the emotional energy. The Monroe Foundation had expanded its programs supporting single parents and families affected by infidelity or abandonment, serving thousands of people annually, and Jessica served as the active chair of the foundation board. She'd discovered that transforming personal pain into systemic change was more satisfying than any individual revenge could ever be, and she was building a legacy that would extend far beyond her own experience. But the most important legacy was standing in the viewing area, wearing matching dresses and waving at their mother. After the shareholders' meeting concluded, Jessica scooped up all 3 girls, carrying them despite the fact that they were getting too big to carry easily, and she took them to her office where they had a drawer full of toys and books for the occasions when Mommy had to work but they wanted to be together. "Did you talk to all those people about boring stuff?" Sophie asked, her analytical mind already categorizing the meeting. "I talked about how to make sure people can spend time with their families," Jessica explained. "That's not boring, that's important." "Like how you spend time with us?" Emma chimed in, always looking for connections between concepts. "Exactly like that," Jessica confirmed. Grace, ever the creative spirit, was already drawing pictures of the meeting, her interpretation featuring much more dramatic gestures than had actually occurred. But Jessica appreciated the artistic license. These 3 girls would someday inherit Monroe Industries, and they would face challenges and betrayals of their own. But Jessica was determined to give them tools that went beyond financial resources. They would understand power, but also responsibility. They would understand justice, but also mercy. They would understand that strength meant protecting those who were vulnerable, not exploiting vulnerability for personal gain. The story that had begun with a cruel midnight betrayal had transformed into something far more meaningful. A lesson about character, consequences, and the long-term effects of our choices on the people who depend on us. And when Emma, Sophie, and Grace were old enough to understand what had happened during those first few weeks of their lives, Jessica would tell them the truth. That their father had made terrible choices, that those choices had consequences, but that people were capable of growth even if that growth came late and was incomplete. She would also tell them about their great-grandfather William, who'd been wise enough to build tests into his estate planning, who'd understood that power without character was worthless, and that true worth revealed itself through adversity. But most importantly, she would tell them that they were loved, that they were valued, and that no circumstance would ever make her abandon them the way they'd been abandoned on that midnight storm. Because the real story wasn't about revenge or justice or even consequences. The real story was about three little girls who deserved better, and a mother who had the power to ensure they got it. And that story was still being written one day at a time, with every decision Jessica made prioritizing the well-being of the daughters who would someday change the world if given the foundation to do so. The midnight confrontation had ended one chapter, but it had also begun another, and this new chapter was about building something beautiful from the wreckage of betrayal, about transforming pain into purpose, and about ensuring that the next generation inherited wisdom alongside wealth. Jessica Monroe had been underestimated, betrayed, and subjected to cruelty that shocked anyone who heard the full story. But she'd also been prepared, resourceful, and committed to justice over revenge. And in the end, that made all the difference.